This is Chris Oatley's ArtCast, episode 81, an interview with Delve video essayist Adam Westbrook, part 1. Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Chris Oatley's ArtCast, the show that goes inside the hearts and minds of successful professional artists. I'm Chris Oatley. I was a visual development artist at Disney before I quit to start my own online art school, the Oatley Academy of Concept Art and Illustration. Find more art instruction and career advice from some of the most inspiring voices in animation, games, comics, and new media at chrisoatley.com. Leonardo da Vinci was a loser. This radical idea was so compelling I had to click play. What followed was a brilliant video about the nature of artistic mastery and how the digital culture is making it more difficult to pursue.
This celebration of youth coupled with technology has distorted our perception of time. The world moves faster and so do our expectations. Today we want success in 17 levels, or 17 minutes, 17 seconds. And when the promise of something new and better is just a click away, who wants to wait 17 years? But that's the thing that connects all of these great people. They played the long game. All of us have the brains and the talent and the creativity to join them, but now, right when it matters, do any of us have the patience?
With the authenticity of Ken Burns and the roguish efficiency of the Freakonomics authors, Adam Westbrook's Delve video essays inspire us to explore the depths of our craft, our culture, and ourselves. In today's interview, Adam and I discuss the dangers of your creative comfort zone, facing our fear of failure, how to communicate complex ideas in clear and compelling ways, and what's to love about the struggles of storytelling. Before you listen to this interview, I recommend watching Adam's two-part Da Vinci series. It'll only take you about 10 minutes, but it will completely change the way you think about your artistic struggles. You can go to chrisoatley.com/delve1, that's delve and the number 1, to watch the videos before the show. And as always, I look forward to hearing your perspective in the comments section afterward. So Adam, just begin by giving us an idea of what you do. What is your kind of your day-to-day, and we'll jump back in time and kind of connect the dots throughout the first half of the interview.
Absolutely. It's that difficult party question.
Exactly.
At the moment, I've kind of called myself lots of different things over the last few years since I've sort of been doing my own thing, which I think is kind of the fun of it, in a sense, is that you get to invent and then reinvent and sort of as times change. But right now I suppose what I've called myself for a while is a video producer and a video publisher as well, or a digital publisher. And that kind of sort of touches on I guess what are the two sides of the work that I do and I'm particularly interested in. So in terms of my own sort of main projects, which is what I try and put most of my time in, I produce video essays, is what I call them, about interesting ideas, interesting knowledge and learning. I'm very interested in how we can make learning more engaging for people. So there's I sort of spend half my time sort of thinking really hard about how we make information and knowledge more interesting and more engaging. But then I also find myself equally sort of fascinated by the other side, which is the publishing side of it. How do we get it out to people in a way that they're going to be in the right frame of mind to receive it and engage it? So that's kind of how I spend a lot of my time in terms of, or if I could, how I would ideally spend my entire day. I'm thinking of just those two things. And then on the side of it, I try and eke out a living doing video post-production and motion graphics animation for different clients. And I also found I've ended up completely by accident, really, doing quite a lot of teaching and training around journalism and storytelling and video. I think for a while people sort of called it or maybe still do, call it a portfolio career.
Right.
This idea that you sort of don't just do one thing, but you have your fingers in several different pies and find yourself making money in different areas, which I found has kind of suited my personality very well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of the new normal for a lot of people, and will continue to be.
I think it is. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the really interesting opportunities that this new age sort of afforded us. I think the idea of doing one thing for your whole career is becoming less and less common.
Yeah, it's totally true. And you're in Paris right now.
Yes, I am. Yeah, I've been here for about a year, just over a year. I was in London for about 4 years previous to that. And it was one of those things where, I'd gotten very comfortable in London. Life was good. I had a really good group of friends and there was enough work, and London's obviously a great city to be in, but it almost ended up like it was almost too comfortable.
Destroy it all.
yeah, absolutely. And so I just sort of found that I got to a real sort of stagnation, not just with work, but in all sorts of other areas of my life. And I just kind of thought, I have this job at the moment that gives me the chance to basically work from anywhere. As long as I have Wi-Fi, basically, and a computer, I can pretty much work anywhere. And I sort of realized that now is or then was my chance to actually work from anywhere if I wanted to. And if I left it any later, soon I'd have a reason to stay in London and, would never have done it. So, it was, I'm not entirely sure why it ended up being Paris. I think I wanted to learn a new language, and French was the only one that I had, even the slightest sort of grasp on already, but I still couldn't speak a word of it really when I arrived. But have sort of managed to sort of stick around long enough to sort of start to feel a bit more like home here. I'm sort of wondering, whether I might, go and try some other places as well while I can, because I tell you, it's really interesting actually creatively. There might be something to touch on later, but when you do just sort of dump yourself in a completely new city where you can't even speak the language, compared to London, where everything was so comfortable and so easy, you suddenly find yourself in a place where even, buying a croissant in the morning is fraught with potential embarrassment and, confusion and difficulty. And I certainly found, looking back on the last year, when you sort of really, if you're like, well, if I can't even buy a croissant without making an idiot of myself, what else am I wrong about? And it's been a really interesting year of questioning, my work and my expertise and my skills, the things that I would have taken for granted that I knew how to do, and really wondering whether maybe I've had it wrong all along.
Wow. So take us back in time. When did the creative instinct emerge? I mean, when did you start getting glimpses of at least the essence of your future as a professional creative?
That's interesting. Well, it goes back to quite a long way, because I was one of those kids that always had that one track mind. They always knew exactly what they wanted to do from a really young age. And actually for me, it was television. I was a child of the 80s and 90s, when in some ways television was having one of its golden ages, I suppose. And so, for me, when I was maybe 9 or 10, that was, all I wanted to do was to work in television. And it's actually one of those things where I'm very jealous of, kids that were born just 10 years after me, because when I was 14, I was sort of alive with this sort of passion to work in TV, but I couldn't do anything about it because, to have a camera's cost, £500,000 or dollars or everything. And of course now, and if I had been able to, if my dad, for example, did have a camera and I was able to borrow it off him, I wouldn't have been able to do anything with the stuff I filmed. But of course now kids today have cameras on their phones and have that kind of creative satisfaction. So for me, it was quite frustrating, I suppose, when I was young, because I wanted to make things and I didn't have the outlet. But anyway, in my teenage years, to sort of, want to impact the world or do all that type of stuff. So my television interest sort of morphed a little bit into journalism, or broadcast journalism, which was kind of what was where my career started. So after university, I trained as a TV and radio reporter. And that was how I spent the first maybe 3 years of my career, I think, up until about 2009. And then that was kind of the year when I decided I sort of took the leap to give it all up and see what the internet was like as a place to make stuff. It was a thing where I was working as a radio reporter in this town in the north of England. And it was actually a really great job, and I was doing some really interesting, hard news stories about, murders and crime and all sorts of things like that, the sort of reporter's dream. But while I was doing that, I'd started a blog writing about the future of journalism. And over time, that sort of started to get more and more of an audience, and more people getting engaged. Now, there was a moment for me, I think, a sort of moment of realization when it was a quiet afternoon in the newsroom, and I was doing a news reading shift. So I was reading the news bulletins, and I'd finished my scripts a little bit early, and I went to just check my emails because I had sort of 5 minutes free before I had to go and read the news. And 3 people had left a comment on a blog post that I'd written earlier that day. I realised it excited me more that 3 people had read and left a comment to something I'd written than then going to read the news, to like 500,000 people. Yeah. And I think that for me was when I sort of realised maybe I do need to go and try something new.
That's fantastic. And was there anything... What about the utilitarian aspects of that, though? Well, first of all, I guess by that point, so 2008, 2009, you could kind of take a blog for... You could take blogs seriously by that point. So that makes sense. But were there any books, authors, anything in particular around that time that made you, or was that entirely kind of from your heart where you're like, I'm going to again, blow it all up and try something completely different?
I would love to say that it was a story where I just, it's that classic story that everyone always sort of tells retrospectively, I decided to take the leap and then I did it. But actually, I think it's really important that I'm honest about it and say that, it took me a really long time to drum up the courage to take the leap, because I was earning pretty much, journalists don't get paid very much, especially in radio. So I was, on the almost, or just very much sort of above the minimum wage, really. And I didn't have any savings, and I had quite a lot of debt from my studies. And I was thinking of, leaving this very cheap town in the north of England and moving to London, which is, on a sort of New York level of expensiveness. So there were lots of reasons for me to put it off or to convince myself it couldn't work. And actually, there was a book. It's funny you asked. I read a book by a guy called Jonathan Fields called Career Renegade, which I think and now would probably be a little bit dated, but it was sort of, because it sort of told you how to sort of make a career out of blogging and podcasting and things like that online. And I think using lots of strategies and platforms that don't really exist anymore. But it just had a couple of chapters in it that were just, sort of brimming with this energy of, now, like what is the worst that can happen type thing. Yeah. And he did have an exercise or a sort of section in the book that really resonated with me, actually, where he said, you should do that exercise where imagine yourself taking whatever leap it is you're going to take, and then actually imagine in really vivid detail what happens if it goes wrong. Okay, so you move to London and you've got this amount of money. How long will that money last if you don't make another penny, if it all goes horribly wrong? And then what will happen then? You run out of money, what do you actually do? And it forces you to think, well, I suppose I'll have to, I don't know, call a friend and sleep on their sofa, and then you start thinking about what's going to happen next. And actually it does 2 things. Firstly, it makes you look at it, rather than being scared by this kind of spectre of what failure could be, because in your imagination, without thinking about it, you imagine it's going to be, somehow you'll end up homeless after 5 days. It does actually make you think very practically about what would happen, but also it makes you realize it just actually wouldn't be that bad. I think my conclusion was, the worst comes to the worst, I have to go and move in with my mum for 3 months and get a job in a cafe and try and start from scratch. And suddenly when you do that, you realize actually it isn't that it isn't that scary.
Right.
And that really for me was a moment when I thought, okay, well, I will do this. I'm prepared to work in a restaurant if it all goes horribly wrong.
Right.
And that's kind of the attitude I've always had, actually, is that, you know, if it meant I kept the freedom I have at the moment, I'd work in a bar or whatever to keep.
Yeah.
Luckily that's not happened yet, but I think part of my self-protection is knowing that I would do that if I needed to.
Yeah, that's it. We think we're going to turn into Gollum or something.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's that thing where so much of it is based when you let your imagination run wild with it, unless you confront what your imagination says, and really break it down into what would actually happen.
Yeah, literally.
It's really useful. Yeah, literally. Yeah, it's a really useful exercise.
Yeah, that's great. And so you read the book. That got the gears turning.
Mm-hmm.
Also doing the blog was getting the gears turning. How did you reach that breaking point, and what did that look like?
Let's see. So it was the summer of 2009, I think it was. And yeah, I think it was partly, I find that if I'm in the same place for more than a year, and notice that, if I start to hear myself say, oh, I remember doing this exact same thing a year ago, I suddenly become very aware of, that I'm not moving or something. So, as a journalist, that was very clear, where I would go into work one day and be covering a story that I'd covered exactly a year ago.
Right.
And it would make me go, oh, I've been here a year. Maybe I should. So I think it was, I'd been doing this job for about a year. So I think that pushed me a little bit. And then the thing actually that in the end that really, again, I'd love to say I just sort of completely, went there of my own accord and summoned up this kind of fantastic courage. One of the things that certainly helped me on the way was through the blog that I'd been writing, got an email from a university down in London who were looking for someone to come in part-time and do in a half an hour or an hour's lecture a week, I think, in video journalism. And so they'd seen my blog and realised I might be a good person for it. They offered me a contract of teaching, 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week for 3 months. And I did the maths and realised it wouldn't be nearly enough to kind of cover my costs. But it was kind of like, this is a really cool new opportunity. Yeah. And it was kind of the hand that needed to just grab my hand and pull me over the threshold. I wonder if if I'm honest with myself, if that hadn't have come, how much longer would I have delayed? But I do remember there was a good 8 months to a year where I was, furiously writing in a journal and reading all these books, really trying to somehow find within myself, or in fact find externally, the bravery to do it.
Right. It's sort of a loose tourniquet.
Yeah.
And so then you put in your notice and moved.
Yes.
Okay.
That was pretty much it. Yeah. That was September 2009. That's when I think I moved to London on the Monday, and then on Friday I was found myself literally teaching video journalism, which was a bit strange, going from radio reporter to university lecturer in 4 days was quite intimidating as well. But I don't know, it's sort of, when you have to do it, you do it, and there's a real sort of sense of feeling alive when you do it as well, I think.
Yeah, I have a course on composition and visual storytelling called Painting Drama, and something that I encourage those students to do from day one is find people. This is not at all difficult to do, to find people who you can help right out of the gate, intellectualizing the process and articulating these abstract concepts of image making. And in doing that, you get better because you start to make your own connections, and you become a better artist because you understand why you make the decisions that you make. And so anyway, I think even very early on, it's important to deliberately put yourself into a position where you're having to articulate these abstract concepts to a group of students in one form or another.
Absolutely. And actually, I think you're on the nail, actually, when you sort of talk about that idea of teaching others as a way of learning yourself. Yeah. For me, that's been in the last year or 2 years, that's been a real kind of foundation for a lot of the work and the projects that I've done have come, they've stemmed from wanting to, or being really fascinated by a topic and wanting to know it and understand it, finding a way to share that knowledge as you learn it with other people, as well as being a great opportunity to build a community around what you do, is also a fantastic way. I think you're right. It's one thing to learn it, but another thing to then explain it to someone else.
Yeah. So you were teaching freelancing, and then were you still doing the blog? And is that still going on now?
The blog has stopped. Okay. I carried it on though for another 3 years, until 2012. And it was kind of, the consistency in that very kind of kind period, actually, where there's lots of uncertainty about work and where my career would go. This kind of weekly or bi-weekly blog post was, one thing that I always kind of came back to. And I became very affectionate for it because it was one of those things, my blog never made me a penny directly in the entire, 6 years I did it. But when I look back, the opportunities that it brought me were insane. I had executives from TV channels who were bringing me in for meetings to talk about ideas, and I was invited to talk at conferences in different bits of the world, and to do training and to make films just from this WordPress blog that cost me nothing to set up. So it was a source of great opportunity, and I think. Happiness in lots of ways as well. It was always, I learned a lot about, obviously the practicalities of, what it is like to publish online. But I also learned a lot about what it is to connect with other people as well, and to make stuff that helps others. I think you've said this already, how important that is. I found that a lot of the emails I would get from readers, or the comments, would be about, they were very inspired by something or excited by something, or, I kind of think that was that kind of gift, I suppose, in a sense, being able to do that for other people made it extremely rewarding as well.
That's great. Is the blog still alive where the listeners could go see the articles?
Absolutely, yeah. So the web address is my name, adamwestbrook.wordpress.com. So I never actually got a proper URL for it in the end either. It was just a good old-fashioned WordPress blog. And I was writing lots about the future of journalism and the future of publishing, as both of those, and storytelling as well, as those three things came in and out of my interest field. And then I think the reason I stopped it in the end, and it's funny, lots of people said I was very stupid for stopping it because it was kind of among my sort of other contemporaries, it was something that I think a lot of them wished that they'd had. But for me, I still look back on it, and it's interesting. Yeah, certainly there was a noticeable correlation between, I stopped blogging, and then the sort of opportunities and work that came my way stopped quite abruptly with that as well. That was really interesting. And for a while it had me a little bit worried. But the reason I stopped it was because I felt like I wanted to start making things that took a lot more time and care and love to make. I wanted to make books or documentaries or, courses, not just kind of weekly blog posts. I think actually, again, looking back, I probably got that wrong, because what I forgot, or I didn't realize, was that actually with a blog and things that are similar, an individual blog post, of course, just takes an hour to write and then 3 minutes to read. But actually it's not about the individual post, it's about the bigger website and the bigger thing that you build. And I think I'd forgotten that I'd actually been building something for 6 years, and thought I'd just been writing blog posts. But it was still good. It was still important to do something new and to move on. And my interests had moved on as well. So I've really enjoyed since doing more ambitious projects rather than blogging. Yeah,
and this is important. I think that consistency and dependability, of course, those things are incredibly important to sustaining any type of content feed, a podcast or a blog or a Twitter feed for that matter, whatever, any kind of these sort of broadcast feeds. However, it's not the end of the world, because that sort of core group of people who love what you're doing are going to be interested in the other things that you're doing. And then you've also created that's the amazing thing about the internet, is that we create things out of nothing. It's just now it's an asset. Now it is a thing. This is a thing that's there forever.
Exactly. We forget sometimes the accumulative effect of the internet, where you make something and it stays there forever, and you sort of start to build this library, this catalog of great things. I think that's a way of thinking about it. And I think in lots of ways we don't appreciate that enough. I think there's a lot of people in fact most people, I think, put things on the internet and don't really think that one day their grandchildren are going to be able to look at that. I'm looking forward to this future where there's a generation of grandparents who've all done naked selfies on Instagram and all this sort of thing. I don't know how they explain that to their grandkids. I don't know, or how we do, but I think also I think it's remembering that like your legacy almost starts now, and I suppose I think of my late grandfather, who got up to all sorts of crazy stuff in the 1930s and 40s, and none of us will ever know about it because there was no record of it. But I think also it's remembering that you don't have to have a one-off hit. I think certainly with the Delve project that I've started working on this year, and those video essays, that thought sustained me a lot. Through the first few months when I'd put a lot of blood and sweat into making these things, and actually they weren't getting watched at all. And it was really important that I reminded myself that they all stay on the internet forever. And they are evergreen. And then maybe it might take you a year, 2, 3, 4, 5 years until you make something that maybe lots of people see. But then when they do, they'll look back and they'll see there's the whole library of other stuff that you've made that will, that cumulatively will hopefully blow people's minds. And
also, if articulating ideas and articulating your own ideals is not necessarily, I can't say it's necessary, but it's almost necessary. It's really helpful. It's vital. It's vital to growing as an artist and as a communicator. Delve couldn't have happened without that blog. Like, you could never have made enough mental connections to reach that sort of critical mass to where it had to become something more elaborate. Absolutely. I mean, I actually came up with the idea for it in 2008. I remember there's actually a journal entry I wrote really excitedly about this idea I'd had. And it's taken me 6 years to actually make it into something real, which is a really long stagnation period. But actually, when I think about it, I don't think it could have happened any sooner. I think it just took me that long. I mean, so much of it really isn't, I think when I first came up with the idea, it seemed like the reason I never did it straight away was because it seemed like that there were problems I couldn't solve. So, for example, the original idea was, as it originally stood, was to make really interesting history documentaries on the internet, because I was a history student and I was watching history documentaries on TV and just saw how boring and formulaic they were. There's lots of, kind of I love Ken Burns, but there's lots of other kind of cliches. Lots of like really terrible keyboard synth music and artillery. There's always an artillery montage if there's something about the Second World War. And I was like, there's such a great opportunity to reinvent the history documentary. Which is what really excited me. But then when I started working on it straight away, this is, in 2008, and it didn't take me very long to realize that actually, if I'm going to make a history documentary, I still have the same problems. The characters are dead and the events I want to film have already happened. So I am basically stuck with artillery montages and, oil paintings. And so that stopped me in my tracks. I was like, damn, I don't know the answer. And when I look back, I think actually I still don't know the answer to that problem. The only thing that's changed is that I'm now in personally and creatively or whatever have reached a maturity where I'm willing to start making it anyway. I think that was for me. Not knowing how to make a great history documentary stopped me making them for 6 years. Wow! So I was finally in a place where I could say, "Well, I'm just going to start making them anyway, and I'll figure out the rest as I go along." Like, it took me a long time to kind of reach that
creative maturity, I suppose.
Yeah, right. Yeah, look while you leap.
Yeah, I think so often we look for. It's very much human nature, isn't it, to sort of need to see a map before you start the journey. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting that so many of the people who have, succeeded in a sense online, who make lots of money online or have big audiences, are people who provide a map in lots of ways. So people who do businesses about how to start your own independent business, or how to do this, that, and the other, is all about showing a map, providing a map to people who could easily do it without a map. But as I say, it's very human nature to want one, I suppose.
Yeah. Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
Before we kind of dive into this Delve project, connect the dots for us. You were freelancing and teaching, and you did the blog for up until 2012. Mm-hmm. What else did that in between time look like? And what was, in particular, how were you exploring this idea of, and it's even hard for me to even say this word because it drives me so insane, but for lack of a better term, the personal brand. How were you sort of thinking about that and developing that, or were you, or how did that all work for you?
Yeah, certainly the last couple of years then, from that point of stopping the blog, have been, I think, a lot of where that, as I say, that sort of maturity sort of started to come. And I say that as if I am now mature. I'm sure actually I'm nowhere near, but as mature as I've ever been in my work, I suppose. So I stopped the blog and I started then working on building bigger things. I wanted to make something that took, months to write or make rather than, hours. Mm-hmm. And the thing that really emerged in those couple of years as well for me was quite a strong fascination with storytelling and the mechanics of narrative. I'm sure that's something, from your career you're really well versed in. But for me, I came at it as a complete outsider, even though, it's funny, in journalism, which was my background, we say, we call what we write stories. What story are you working on, or what's your lead story, or that type of thing. But actually, in journalism, a journalist's training in story and their knowledge of it is virtually non-existent. It's not much beyond beginning, middle, and end, or the inverted pyramid. I just started to become really interested in what are these kind of underlying mechanisms. Are there any mechanisms, or is it all just, art and guesswork and magic, or are there, strategies at least? And so I started, there's loads of stuff out there that with screenwriters in mind. There's Robert McKee's kind of classic book story, and Christopher Vogler's book about narrative structure and that type of thing that lots of screenwriters read. And that was all that there was. So I just kind of started to read that, and I started to see lots of parallels, or potential parallels, with non-fiction work, with kind of factual stories. And you can listen to things like This American Life and Radiolab, which are, I think, also really proving that when they're at the top of their game. It's just extraordinarily nuanced and powerful storytelling. And it just felt like this kind of black magic that I didn't understand. And that's obviously always the great driver for learning something, is when there's this kind of problem that the answer isn't obvious. So I sort of started this year or two of trying to learn and share with other people how storytelling works. And I published so my first project after the book was publishing a magazine, a quarterly magazine called Inside the Story, which was sort of like trying to look at storytelling in a very practical, down-to-earth, gritty way. What is a narrative structure, or how do you, what is the inciting incident, and can you use it in nonfiction, all this type of thing. And it was all really me learning how storytelling worked, writing some articles about it, and then putting it into a magazine for other people. And the more I learned about storytelling, the more I understood, the more mysteries were unlocked. And so the more I wanted to keep digging and diving. And basically, I had a couple of years where I stopped doing video, which has always been my, as I say, from being a kid wanting to make television, it's always been about TV or, some kind of motion picture medium for me. But I had a couple of years, last year in particular, where I didn't I think last year I made one video in January 2013, and then the rest of the year was anything but video. But as the year went on, I learned more and more. I started to sort of really it wasn't enough for me to write about how storytelling was done. I was like, I really want to actually start putting some of this into practice and start telling some stories. And the break from video was really helpful. I think it just kind of reset the button a little bit. So when it got to the autumn of last year, the fall of last year, I was sort of really feeling like, okay, I'm ready now to try and put some of this into practice. And I had this kind of vague apparition of an idea about what, this kind of project might look like. But as I say, I think the key was all along was reaching that stage in my mind where it didn't matter anymore whether it worked or whether it didn't. I just wanted to try it. And I didn't really care, in a sense, whether I got it right. And you asked about the brand stuff as well. I don't know what I was really doing that. I'm one of those things where I don't know. I've over the years I've sort of built up an okay Twitter following, which I think mostly is just by being on there for long enough, rather than trying. I think it's something that I've struggled with it in a sense of how important is it to spend time being on social media and doing that type of thing, and how important is it just to get good at doing what you do and focusing on that instead. And I think I've realized that I love the great line from Stephen Pressfield. I don't know if you're familiar with him, and he's an author who's written quite a few great books about creativity and art, including The War of Art, which is a real classic. But he wrote one called Turning Pro. And there's this great, it's a chapter about social media, and it's got 4 words in it. And it's like amateur, and the 4 words are amateurs tweet, pros work. Was basically it. And for me, that was like, okay, yeah, if I want to be professional at this, if I want to get really good at mastering this medium, I need to spend less time on Twitter and more time just making good work and getting better at it.
That's challenging.
Which is hard, I know, right? I'm still on Twitter every day, which is, just evidence of failing in that regard. But I'll get there. But by the end of last year, the magazine had built up. My interest in storytelling was really strong, and but I was really starting this project from zero. I didn't really have an audience ready and waiting for it. It went out to 0 people. Which affected how I approached it. I think I decided that I would, as the essays themselves sort of say, I was ready to wait quite a long time for them to work, for people to watch them. I was happy for them to sit on there for ages and get 100 views. I would have preferred them to stay anonymous for a while, I think, so I could get better at it before people started noticing them.
Yeah. And so the January 2013 video, what was that?
So that was actually a video about how to make a video that I did.
So meta.
I know. Well, I found that was one of the reasons that I stopped writing the blog, was because I didn't want to be known as a journalist about journalism, or a storyteller who was known for writing about storytelling. I wanted to be known for someone who did good storytelling. I think, although I wouldn't dismiss it entirely, because as we've said, being able to share what you learn and what you do is a really important part of the process, I think. So I think you always do have to get a bit meta about these things, probably. But yeah, it was. I just was really increasingly finding that the only things I ever sort of felt the inclination to write or make a film about or blog about was about what I did, or how we did what I did, I suppose. Yeah. And it's been a long time, other than doing projects for clients. This is really one of the first projects where I've tackled something outside of my own area of expertise.
And so the video about making a video, where did that idea come from? Why that? Why is that the one thing?
Yeah, it's actually borrowed or inspired by a book I read when I was about 14, when I was, in this kind of, basically when I couldn't, when I was 14, I couldn't make videos in the 90s. I read books about it instead. And I read this book I can't remember what it was called, but it was a training book given to BBC cameramen or something, or BBC directors in the 80s. Like, that's how kind of hard I had to look for this type of stuff.
That is awesome.
And it was a book, I can't remember what it was called, but it was by a guy called Harris Watts, who was some kind of director of drama in the 1980s, and he did lots of BBC training programs. Anyway, he does this great analogy for how the filmmaking or how the video process works, which is, he says it, it's like making a film is like making a meal. And what he means by that is the filming of it is basically just going to the supermarket and buying the ingredients. The film itself, like a meal, doesn't come together until you're in the kitchen, which is the equivalent of the edit suite.
Yeah.
And that's where you're mixing the right ingredients in the right order, in the right proportion, in order to create something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that always really interested me, because in video and in television and film, so much energy and noise goes into cameras and lenses and all the stuff that happens on set. All the glamour is about what happens in front of a camera. But actually, it's just going and just collecting ingredients. And for me, I realized, the magic is always about how you assemble those ingredients together. So basically, this film was that analogy just made visual. Uh-huh. So I filmed a friend of mine baking a cake, of all things, and then juxtaposed the kind of words from his book over those images at the right place to try and make that point, basically. So yes, it was a way of sort of explaining that metaphor, but just visually.
Wow. So it was just you had read the book when you were young, and you had that still in the back of your mind, and but still, it takes so much effort to make a video. There has to be something fueling that, some goal or some inspiration to actually make it happen. You know what I mean? Like, because it got finished.
It did. And there is something about video that it feels like, of all the different mediums that, someone could choose, it is the biggest pain in the backside. The editing is time consuming, but probably no different to doing a webcomic or Photoshop or whatever. But, having to sort of just things, like arranging location permissions and traveling to different places to film, and waiting for the weather to clear up, and so much. It is one of those things that's so energy sapping. I think you're right. You do have to sort of have I think for me it was an idea that was just niggling in my head, and I found I kept coming back to it, and I just needed to kind of lance that boiler and just do it. And it's again, no one else had sort of done it online or anything, so I thought it was a good chance to do it. But yeah, I filmed it, I think, over Christmas, just before I moved to Paris, and then cut it in my first week in Paris. And I mean, it sort of sits there online. It gets sort of, I use it when I teach video still, at the start of the day, and I think other lecturers borrow it as well.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe the fuel for that fire was, I'm moving to Paris, that sort of being an emotional undercurrent of, I want to be a practitioner. And so I need a showcase, I need a proof of concept, combined with the fact that you were trying to shake things up. And so it's almost like you needed that. It almost seems like that was like the perfect storm of, okay, we got to do something. We got to make something. And so here's an idea that makes sense. So it was like the idea was almost the opportunity, and then the emotional undercurrent was the sense of urgency that was no doubt exacerbated by the fact that you were going to move.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's actually the same with how Delve eventually came into being. It was, I really need to put this into practice soon. And that idea was the kind of Da Vinci series was, an idea that excited me enough, that I felt that I could make something good out of it, and it, without having to worry too much about what it was going to be. Right. Certainly one of the hardest things is always, what's going to be your next video, or your next anything. Right. And I think one of the things I've been seeking, and I'm still seeking in a sense as well, is almost a way to take the decision out of that process, to take the choice out of that process. Wow. Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about, where Delve might go in the future. And I've been interested in trying to find some kind of way of using it as a way to adapt books, for example, or convey the ideas that other people have written in books, where I don't have to I don't have to search for ages for the right thing. I can force myself, constrain myself into a specific run of ideas. So one of the things I've also been doing is I've been experimenting with Instagram video. Those kind of little 15-second videos as a way of trying to convey similar knowledge in video. And I also tried this idea of can I come up with a project where the work is already decided what it's going to be, and I just have to wake up in the morning and say what's next on the list.
Right.
So what I ended up doing was I've started to adapt a book called A Little History of the World, which was written by this German guy in the early 1930s, and only translated into English about 10 years ago. And it's a children's book about the history of the world from ancient Egypt to today. And I kind of thought that would be a cool little,
That's awesome.
I could adapt that, into little Instagram chapters. And that kind of worked. I didn't have to think too hard about what the next one was going to be. I just opened up the book and saw what was the next chapter and started work on that. And it's interesting when you look back, at early cinema, how often Disney, for example, or Hitchcock, how many of their films, were adaptations of other people's works.
Yeah, my friends Laura Innes, and who's a comics creator, and my friend Justin Copeland, who's a story artist at was at Marvel and is now at WB. The two of them and I do another podcast called the Paper Wings Podcast, and that's all about visual storytelling specifically. And that's one of our number one things is, artists struggle so much with the blank canvas, and it's like, well, I understand that whole thing. I get it. That's real. It's just that sometimes you can just change the conversation by having a bigger ongoing project. If you just take the time to be explicit about making lists of what needs to happen to finish the project, then, like you said, if you sit down and you have 90 minutes to work, maybe you just put the kids to bed, but you've still got to get up for the day job the next morning, and all you have is 90 minutes to work. If you sit down and you're having to make the blank canvas decision every single time, most likely that will severely retard your productivity. Whereas if you have, I have to draw page 24. Yeah. At least all of that, you just fast track right to how do I draw page 24? What am I doing? Thumbnails? Am I doing inks? Whatever, And anyway, that's huge. I guess I'm just trying to emphatically highlight that idea of let the work decide for you. Absolutely. And I think also, removing as many decisions as possible is in some sense is useful. There's that kind of, I don't know whether it's true or not, but there's that story that Barack Obama only has 4 suits or something. Yeah. So it's like, he just wears the next one in the line, and it's one less decision he has to make. Yeah. That's huge. In the day of running the world. Yeah. I never pick the restaurant just because I'm like, you know what? I want to spend my limited time and emotional energy on other things. My brain is limited, and I'm just trying all the time to a point where actually I think it can kind of get unhealthy socially sometimes, but I'm trying to just optimize. Just trying to make every moment count. I think, I completely agree. I think actually, it kind of chimes with a lesson I'm learning right now, actually. I'm sort of mid-production on the next essay, awesome. The next Delve essay, and I've spent the last sort of 3. In fact, it took a lot longer than I expected, but I spent a long time in the sort of story design process of working out what the story was and what order I was going to tell it in, and how I was going to make it an engaging story. And I found one of the things that's been really one of the sort of insights I've had is that it gets so much easier if you break it down into lots and lots of smaller decisions. Yeah. You don't sort of think constantly about some bigger, grander narrative thing, but you have, what is the one thing the story is trying to say, and then you just run every single sentence in your script or every single image cross-reference it against that controlling idea and say, is this essential for that? Yes or no?
And then it's either one of the two, and you just make the decision. If it's a no, it goes from the script, or it gets dropped from the storyboard or whatever. And suddenly it adds a sort of rigor, or even though it sounds like it's almost too mechanical to be creative, it's too robotic. It almost just gives it a discipline that just means you don't have to spend so much time making a decision.
Right. And not to mention, there are plenty of other decisions to be made. It's not like you aren't going to be surprised, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sort of trying to reach that stage where everything in a story is intentional. Like, I think that's sort of what I've been chasing for a while, is how much of it is in there because it was the first idea I had. Right. And how much of it is in there because it is the best way to do it, and everything is in there for a reason. And I'm sort of starting to appreciate, a potential beauty in a piece of art that is just the essence of what it is trying to do. A movie that starts at the latest point it can possibly start and ends as soon as possible. Yeah. That seems very rare these days. We've seen, in a world of sort of 3-hour movies, it seems we've forgotten how to tell a story in 90 minutes like we used to. That's almost like a great sort of indicator of that sort of discipline, is your ability to almost make something that's smaller or shorter or more of the bare bones with less, flair and, kind of sparkle and shine that people try and put on things.
I'm not crazy about the most recent Coen brothers films, but this is something that I'm really fascinated by, is how it seems to me, and I've thought about this a lot, it seems to me like that's what they're trying to do. True Grit, their remake of True Grit, and then their most recent one, Inside Llewyn Davis, that is to me very apparent that they're doing exactly that. They're going, what is we're not meandering at all. And where I want a little more self-indulgence from them. I want a little more poetry, and that's what I feel like the last, kind of the third act of True Grit, of their True Grit remake, is so abrupt and it's so tight that I feel like it's a lesser version of the Coen brothers, even though I think I still respect it and love them because I get it. I understand. I think I understand what they're trying to achieve there. I think they're going, hey, how do we be as efficient as possible?
And I think it's not about being efficient in, financial or time or anything like that. It's more about it's almost like out of respect for the audience. Yeah, exactly. Sort of saying, I don't want to waste people's time. Come to see my movie. Let's tell them the story in the shortest way. I mean, I think the one film I saw that sort of achieved that last year was Blue Jasmine, the Woody Allen film, which wasn't great, but it was only 90 minutes long. And it is great, actually, when a film finishes at 90 minutes. You're like, oh, great, I've still got the rest of my evening left. Exactly. Do something else. And then some films you kind of feel like, you've sort of been declared missing. You've been away for so long. So I think that I was having an interesting discussion with a friend just about that very thing, and how much of it is about, can you sell a ticket for a 90-minute movie, or do people not feel that they've got their money's worth, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like Woody Allen has done that a lot. He's been doing that for a while, actually, with his, there was Match Point a while ago, and there were a few of these films that he's done that I feel like, it wasn't until you brought up Blue Jasmine that I realized, oh, that's true. He's been exploring that. But anyway, that's very fascinating to me, and this whole, the art and editing, and then but whimsy and letting yourself explore, and then I think there's a nature of what you're trying to communicate. So for example, in the Delve videos, efficiency I feel like is it's a very high priority for many reasons. The fact that it's on the internet, and the fact and there's even a utilitarian purpose in, especially if these earlier videos are more succinct. It will help to grow the business more, because more people will see it and more people will share it and more people will finish watching it and reach the conclusion that you were trying to direct them toward, and so forth.
I mean, that's the danger, isn't it? With the gauntlet, I'm aware that I'm running in the way I'm choosing to tell these stories. It's the opposite approach to how I was always taught to sort of convey information as a journalist, which is, you have the inverted pyramid, which says, you put the most important thing at the start so people don't miss it. and I'm building these stories in the opposite way. So, like you said, the realization, the idea comes in the last 30 seconds, and it's how do you get them there in the most interesting, enlightening way. But yeah, it means there's a big danger that a lot of people don't make it to the conclusion.
It's so enjoyable, and it's such a huge payoff that I feel like the power in that is what that if you can combine that huge reward at the end, because you're opening up these information gaps, and then you even do it at the end of the first video where you talk about Craig Ferguson and you show the shot with the robot and everything, and it's like, wait, what does that have to do with anything? And you're dropping the breadcrumbs the whole time.
Breadcrumbs is a word that appears in a lot of my sort of story notes as I sort of build these essays.
Really?
Yeah. It's sort of that idea that how do you apply, say, the dramatic sort of technique, if you like, to a documentary essentially about, it could be anything, the weather or space or maths. And I've struggled with that for a long time. I feel like I'm sort of starting to get some sort of clarity on it. But I think one of the things is the idea that the three acts aren't really anything to do with beginning, middle, and end, but they're all about conflict. So it's not act 1, 2, and 3. It's introduce conflict, heighten conflict, resolve conflict.
Wow.
As the kind of that kind of underlying shape of any story. And I think that's sort of how I'm trying to apply that to building these things, where it is, open up a big question, open up even more questions, and then try and answer all the questions at the end. And seeing whether that is a way of trying to translate. Part of me half the time thinks I'm just being crazy for trying to take Hitchcock's technique or, kind of the classic dramatic technique and apply it to documentary. Sometimes I sort of catch myself saying, why don't you just go and write a bloody screenplay if that's what you really want to do?
Right.
But I don't know, there's been this sort of things. I mean, it's not an easy fit at the moment. There's still I still need to figure out, or people need to figure out a lot about, how some of these things can be applied to conveying information rather than drama.
Exactly.
But I think if we can make it work, it could be really important.
Yeah.
I think one of the sort of founding, or the ideas that sort of driven me to do Delve is, it sort of feels like, in the information age and the internet age, we have access to all the knowledge of the human race has accumulated over the last 5,000 years, but we're not getting any smarter. It doesn't feel like that knowledge is more accessible than it ever has been. And like, if we can find a way to unlock that, to try and take anything as complex or as dry or something that people would normally write off and never then engage with. If you can find a way to almost to unlock that, the energy inside it to be as fascinating as it, because everything's fascinating, everything's interesting. It just doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily presented in an interesting way. And I just sort of think, there's great potential one day to have information fly a lot further and travel to more minds.
I'm a big fan of Abraham Lincoln, and I have been for a very long time. And I read this book in college, I think, called The Day Lincoln Was Shot. And it's about the Lincoln assassination, but it's written as like a pulpy crime novel, but it's not exploitative. I mean, it's very reverent, but it has that sort of pulse of a crime novel. And that was pivotal for me in kind of shaping my storytelling paradigm. Mm-hmm. And again, the Lincoln assassination is inherently interesting. And even if you kind of take a very factual approach, it's compelling. So maybe that's not the biggest challenge, but nonetheless, this idea of communicating and how many books have been written about the Lincoln assassination? So many. But this idea of taking this historical event, you're not writing a dramatization, you're not writing a fictional version, you're still just reporting the history, but you're doing it in a way that is equally as compelling as a screenplay or a graphic novel or whatever. That has been fascinating to me for a very long time.
Absolutely. And I I catch myself sort of thinking that same thing sometimes, that, what if the story of quantum physics could be as suspenseful as a Hitchcock film, or as or as emotional as a great Pixar film. Like, what if we did actually try and apply those standards instead of just trying to act like trying to produce some kind of dry, flat record of what happened. I think, that your Lincoln story there is really interesting, because clearly that stuck with you. Yeah. And I wonder how much of it is because of
it was real,
that book. Yeah, exactly. That and it's very clear that storytelling is a very potent way for the brain to record and make sense and remember things. I had a realization several years ago when I was trying to help my sister. I have a younger sister, and she was studying for her sort of high school exams. I loved history, but she really didn't find any interest in it at all. But she had to do this history exam, and her module was about South African history and apartheid. Mm-hmm. And so I was trying to help her revise, and she'd give me her textbook, and I was sort of going through it, asking her questions, like what happened in 1964, or who was this person, or what was this event? And she was really struggling. She was like, I don't know, was it this? And she was getting it completely wrong. And then I turned the page, and this name came up, Stephen Biko. And so I asked her, I said, who was Stephen Biko? And suddenly her eyes lit up, and she said, oh, well, he was this campaigner in the 1960s, and then he was arrested, and he was beaten up in prison, and then he died. And she told me all this kind of rich detail. And I put the book down, and I said, Maddie, how come you know nothing about South African history? How can you tell me so much about this one guy? And she just shrugged her shoulders and said, oh, we just watched a film about him in class. Yeah. And for me, it was like, so it's almost like, if you can wrap facts inside a great story, they just get cemented in the brain so much more easily than any other way.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So I think the potential is really exciting, but it is really hard work.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that's what I quite like about it, actually.
You have to live in an abstraction for so long, or at least that's what I've found in my own experience. You have to just get so comfortable with abstraction, and then making almost like a sketch, a thumbnail sketch of just a gesture attempt at, is this sort of the broad sweep, kind of the armature of the story? How about that? It's like one brush stroke, and you just, okay, is that it? No. How about that? How about that? No. How about that? No. And just making the very beginning attempts at how those many, many pieces would fit together, and then it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, or it does start to work, and then you realize, oh my God, it all falls apart at the end. I can't tie these things together. And it's that just sort of living in that. You can't glue anything down for a long time. It all has to be just tacked on the board or whatever for so long, and you're constantly moving. And then finally, when it's almost too late, you finally go, okay, we just have to commit here. And that's sort of I found that to be the last kind of final, massive edits, and just throwing away tons and tons of stuff, and just going, there's no time, you got to get rid of it, And
that's absolutely been my experience, actually, of doing the story design on these video essays. Is I read something, a very short piece by James Cameron, the director. I think he called it Strange Days, and he was writing about, he once tried to write a screenplay for a Spider-Man movie. I think he was one of the people who's trying to do a new Spider-Man a while ago. And he sort of describes these kind of early strange days of an idea, how everything is almost like the formation of the universe, where everything is just gas, everything is a cloud of vapor, and you're flailing around trying to grab some sense of certainty somewhere, and it's all just a gas. It all just goes through your fingers. And then as time goes on, the gas starts to clump together, and then you start to get some solid objects, and suddenly in the last few days, he can say he can sit on an idea, can be like a vapor for months, and then it's like an exponential curve. In the last days or hours, productivity goes straight up, and he can just write half the screenplay in half a day. Wow. And for me, that's been, I think it's part of the challenge, as I think it's the same for any type of creative endeavor, is how well can you handle, I think it's called the negative, what is your negative capability? I think that was how Keats, the poet, described it, is how well can you tolerate not knowing?
Yeah, exactly.
How long can you go on saying, I don't know the answer yet, and I'm going to keep looking? So when you said, you did those thumbnail sketches and is it this idea? No. Is it this idea? No. And you keep looking. That's really hard because, our brains want the answer straight away, and they will leap to the first, that's what everyone's first idea is also, almost always the one that gets made, is because our brains just look for closure wherever they can get it. And it's so hard to say, no, even if I think I like that idea, I'm going to force myself into uncertainty for even longer and, keep looking. And I think if you can, that's what I found with this current essay has been the hard bit, is sort of knowing that it's not right and just being able just to sit there for another week and just keep sort of chipping away at it until I feel, new ideas start to come through. I think that's sort of an important part of the creative process.
In part 1 of our interview, Adam and I talked about how the comfort zone can also be the danger zone for creative people. When Adam started the Delve project, he left his career as a radio journalist and moved to Paris. You certainly don't have to do something that radical, but what is one new project, routine, or decision you could introduce to help shake things up in 2015? Go to chrisoatley.com/delve1, that's DELVE1, the number 1, and join the conversation in the comments. And be sure to join us for the next episode of the ArtCast, where Adam and I talk about becoming a lifetime learner, the storyteller's moral responsibility, and how social media can confuse your creative process. This podcast is a production of the Oatley Academy of Concept Art, Illustration, and Visual Storytelling. I'm Chris Oatley, your host and producer. Our editor is Kevin Chandler. Production support was provided by Travis Bond and Anya Marcos. Our theme music is provided by Storybook Steve. Recurring musical segments are provided by Storybook Steve and Kangaralian. We are a proud member of the Visual Voice Podcasting Network, and you can find all of our available shows at chrisoatley.com/shows.